Yogena chittasya padena vajam malam sarirasya cha vaidyagena yopakarottam pravaram muninam Patanjalim pranjaliranatosmi. Sudve Patanjalim vyasam shankaram cha manitrayam kartra sutrasya bhashyasya kramat vivaranasya cha. So we are reopening the class. Now I shall try to give a short synopsis of the different aspects of yoga that we discussed during the last several sessions. First, Patanjali defines yoga as cessation of our sense of self, misidentifying itself with different objects, different modifications associated with different momentary experiences. See, when we see an object, we identify ourselves with that object through subject-object relationship, through seer-seen relationship. We are the experiencer and something else is the object of experience. When we see an object, what happens? The mind itself takes the form of that object. If you have any doubt, you can take this example. Suppose you see a picture in the morning and you closely observe that picture. In the evening, or maybe after 10 years, if you are a painter, you will be able to visualize, re-experience seeing that picture in front of you. That's why great painters are able to paint pictures. For musicians, when you learn music, we listen to a music when the teacher teaches, and then in the evening we try to sing that again. Now what is happening? When we see an object, our mind takes the form of that object. And when that memory returns to our mind, again mind goes back to that stage where it identified itself with the object it sees. So, every time when we encounter some experience outside, when the eyes, ears, sense of touch, sense of smell, or any of these 5 senses of perception come in contact with different objects of experience in the external world, what happens? They give rise to so many modifications, and then we identify our own personality in connection with that experience. So all these experiences create a modification, and our mind stuff becomes a bundle of modifications. Now, the purpose of yoga, according to Patanjali's system, is to put a stop to this misidentification. And this is possible only when we make a close study of the nature of modifications in our mind. For this, Patanjali gives a very scientific and rational analysis of the functions of human mind. One of his greatest contribution to modern psychology is the analysis of how the mind reacts to different experiences. When mind encounters an experience, it creates a modification called vritti, which later becomes a potential characteristic which is called samskara. And our mind is full of these accumulated samskaras that we have encountered in this life and innumerable previous life. So, these tendencies, modifications, become samskaras, and they become our characteristics, and gradually they prompt us to repeat the same action if the action is associated with a pleasant result, happy result. If the result is not happy, then our mind is forcibly turned away from that tendency. But the effect is the same. So, Patanjali classifies the human mind system into 5 categories. In fact, this is one of the most scientific and rational analysis of human mind. In Patanjali's Sutras, small statements, and also in the commentaries on Patanjali Sutras written by great commentators like Shankaracharya, Vyasa, Vijnana Bhikshu, and several others, several of whom were Buddhists. In these commentaries, they have elaborated these classifications. So I shall try to give a graphic picture, of this analysis and how these vrittis function. Patanjali says the entire human mind system, depending upon the way it functions, the way it encounters with different objects in the external world, can be divided into 5 categories. One is called a natural restless state of mind, which in Sanskrit he calls kshipta. Natural restlessness. When you may have seen people suffering from mood swings, suddenly getting elated, and suddenly accumulated emotions within, manifesting in different forms. Anger, hatred, jealousy, malice, and so on. Mind becomes completely restless. It is not able to concentrate even on worldly pursuits. This is the most tragic, the most unfortunate state of human mind system, which he calls kshipta. In simple language, it can be called restless state. Happiness, unhappiness, anger, jealousy, sudden elation, sudden depression, suddenly new ideas come, and then the mind goes to opposite ideas. Many cases of anxiety neurosis, especially they will call it obsessive problems, perfection, too much of perfectionism, washing mania, all these are related to this kind of inherent states of mental delusions, irrational thought currents. The next state is the state of an idiot. It's called stupefied. A stupefied state of mind. When you get infatuated with some undesirable worldly thought currents. Too much of greed for money. Too much of obsessive desire for something. And mind becoming completely enslaved by some worldly desires, worldly objects. So that it cannot think of anything higher. It is stupefied. It becomes infatuated by some worldly desires, worldly ambitions. So that that mind cannot think of anything higher than the most worldly sensory pleasures and objects related to them. This is one state where people cannot think of anything higher than their most practical, ultra-pragmatic, utilitarian things. Everything we want to relate to some tangible, selfish, enjoyable results. In fact, in many cases, unless we de-link this connection with the consequences. I mean, unless we can do certain noble things without thinking of their immediate, tangible, enjoyable results or consequences, there can be no peace of mind. But mind becomes completely stupefied, enslaved, infatuated by desire for some worldly object, which is called mudha state. Mudha itself means completely deluded, infatuated, stupefied state, where you cannot even think of poetry, philosophy, or painting, or anything. Just living at the most pragmatic, utilitarian level. The third stage which Patanjali describes is Vikshipta state. There are elaborate commentaries in Sanskrit language on this state of human mind. When many psychologists deal with these topics, but the problem with psychologists is that they try to solve the problems of the mind at mental level. Because it is with a sick mind that we are trying to find solutions for the sickness of mind. So Vedanta says that mind should be linked to a higher supramental level to understand and solve the problems of mind. So, at the third stage, which is called Vikshipta, completely distracted. Here also you find an element of restlessness. But this restlessness is different and distinct from the restlessness that we mentioned earlier. The kind of restlessness that we discussed earlier is the restlessness of a most worldly type. Jealousy, anger, malice, extreme liking for something, and it will be always related to extreme dislike for something else. Extreme attachment, obsessive attachment, which almost enslaves us, is always invariably related to an equally powerful aversion towards something else. In Sanskrit, we call it raga and dvesha. Raga is attachment, obsessive attachment, almost to the point of total enslavement of the mind to something. It is called raga. Its opposite is dvesha, aversion. You cannot be extremely, in almost to an idiotic extent, be attached to something without foolishly being hostile to something else. Because mind doesn't function in a single track. Now, this is the state of the first condition, kshipta. We are now dealing with another kind of restlessness, which is called vikshipta, distraction. Here, we get attracted towards a higher spiritual ideal. But we cannot stay there. It's like the pendulum of the clock that moves in one direction and then in the opposite direction. So, most spiritual seekers belong to this category. If you analyze why we are not able to keep our mind fixed on a spiritual idea, we just look inward and try to analyze our own mind, we feel sometimes when we read a book, we listen to a lecture, when we listen to some devotional music, suddenly mind gets elated, wonderful. And then after some time, the mind goes to the opposite extreme. Here restlessness is there, but it is the restlessness that is similar to a pendulum of a clock that moves in the opposite directions. The first restlessness is complete dissipation of mental energy that we as the most tragic, most chaotic condition of human mind, which is called kshipta, or the state of total restlessness. Then the state of infatuation, stupefaction, mudha. The third stage of restlessness is called vikshipta, where in Sanskrit language called Visheshena Kshiptam. It is distracted in a special way. It is suffering from restlessness, but restlessness of a special type, where we have had some encounter with a great spiritual idea. But that is not lasting, because after some time, the mind throws up some other contrary thought currents, which upset the equilibrium of the mind. So the pendulum of the clock has swung into one direction, then it starts swinging in the opposite direction. Most of the spiritual problems for spiritual seekers are related to this state of human mind, where we are somehow able to connect with the spiritual idea, but mind doesn't remain focused on that spiritual idea for a long time. Immediately the mind takes the opposite course. This is Vikshipta state. Now, the reason why our mind suddenly takes an opposite swing, it moves in the opposite direction. Accumulated tendencies and impressions. Lack of sincere faith, or it is sometimes called, Sri Ramakrishna uses one term, it's called Vyakulada, intense desire, where when a desire for some higher spiritual idea becomes intense and strong and focused. And again, Sri Ramakrishna uses another term, keeping the mind in a straight track. Sometimes inner deception, inner duplicity. We want to pretend to be spiritual. So their mind divides itself into different categories. So on one part of the mind wants to be spiritual, the other part of the mind wants to make a little money also. So by some means, by hook or crook. So there is a desire for spiritual growth, but there is also a desire for worldly pursuits. So there is a lack of one-pointedness. This is the cause of this distraction. It's called the third stage. The fourth stage of human mind, according to Patanjali, is a state of one-pointed concentration. Now one may ask the question, can our mind remain focused on one idea for a long time? This question is often raised in the commentaries. We already discussed two states of restlessness. The most primitive state of human mind, where restlessness due to anger, jealousy, aversion, malice, desire for worldly pleasures, and absolute complete lack of any higher desire in life. That's the first state of human mind, the most primitive state of restlessness, which is called kshipta. The third stage is called vikshipta, which is visheshena kshipta. Means it is distracted in a special way, where you have read some spiritual books, listened to some spiritual ideas, so mind has some attraction, some love for spiritual things, but then accumulated tendencies, impressions, not only accumulated in this life, but accumulated in innumerable previous life. They come back in torrents, and they completely upset the equilibrium of the mind. Third stage. So there is no continuity of thought. That's the problem of the third stage. In fourth stage, what happens? Your mind is focused, concentrated. It doesn't mean that mind remains inactive. The same spiritual idea continues to emerge and re-emerge in the mind. There is continuity of spiritual ideas flashing within our mind. This is the state of ekagra, it's called, it means the fourth state, the state of one-pointed concentration. So, for all spiritual seekers, their goal should be to evolve, to grow from the state of distraction, like the pendulum of the clock, towards the state of one-pointed concentration. When conflicting thought currents, negative thought currents emerge in the mind, well, today I won't do that. When mind suddenly gets upset, today I won't read those good spiritual books. I would rather go to some other place. So because these tendencies and memories, samskaras are coming from previous life. So they push aside the positive thought currents that we may have accumulated in innumerable life. For some years, we read spiritual books, practiced meditation. So some samskaras are being created and stored up in the mind. But then, suddenly one day, mind takes an opposite swing. So Patanjali says, when such opposite thought currents emerge in the mind, we must think of its contrary thoughts. When desire for worldly pleasures come and upset the equilibrium of the mind, then we must think of the evil of going after worldly pleasures. That is a pratibhaksha bhadena vitarka bhavanam. Patanjali says, when there is an object, when there is an obstacle in the form of contrary thought that emerges in the mind, it should be completely pushed aside by the opposite positive thought currents. In this way, there will be a continuity in positive thought currents. This is the fourth state that Patanjali speaks about. The fifth state is the goal of yoga. That is the state where all thought currents completely stop, which means we become completely identified with the supreme reality. This is the ultimate purpose of yoga. Now, Patanjali says, this is how human mind works, depending upon the impressions, modifications, thought currents that emerge in the mind. All these are the result of our previous activities. Activities need not be physical activities. Thoughts, memory, dreams, a stray idea that emerges in the mind. All these can give birth to modifications. So, in the fifth sutra of the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, the Samadhipada, second chapter, he says, remember, Patanjali, I have to say a few things about the structure of Patanjali's work. I've already explained this earlier. Patanjali's sutras are divided into 4 chapters. Altogether, there are 196 sutras. Sutras means small, pithy statements, not in full sentences. Sometimes there are full sentences, but mostly small, pithy statements. Total 196. In some books, 2 sutras are combined in one context, in which case you may call 195, divided into 4 chapters. The way in which the whole text is organized is somewhat different from practical path of spiritual practice. He first deals with samadhi, first chapter. The second chapter, he deals with the results, the supernatural results, the consequences of the spiritual practices, sadhana pada. The third chapter deals with different characteristics. Fourth, deal with liberation. So these are the 4 chapters. First chapter, Samadhipada, deals with samadhi, which is the supreme goal of yoga practice, which leads to liberation, that is kaivalya, which is described in the 4th chapter. The second chapter deals with the means, the different practices, different characteristics that we must slowly develop, the means, the methods of practice. The third chapter deals with the supernatural powers that may accrue as a result of this practice. Fourth chapter deals with kaivalya, which is called liberation. Now, in the first chapter, that is Samadhipada, the fifth sutra speaks about these modifications that emerge in the mind. Vrittaya, Panchatayaha, Klishta, Aklishtaha. Vrittis are fivefold. They may be helpful in spiritual life. They may not be helpful in spiritual life. Many vrittis are unhelpful. So if, Patanjali says, if some unnecessary or harmful thought currents emerge in the mind, we must remember they may be unhelpful. But there are many helpful vrittis also that we may have accumulated in the mind, which may re-emerge. These vrittis are divided into 5 categories. First category is a broad category dividing into helpful and unhelpful, painful and not painful. These 2 categories. Klishtaha, aklishtaha. Klishtaha means painful vrittis. Often we can find when we try to do something noble and good, suddenly a counter thought may emerge in the mind, which may prompt us to withdraw from doing that noble, desirable thing. It may not necessarily be counter thoughts. These thoughts may come from a different person. That also, ideas, thought currents. Of course, they are subjective, but the subjective thought currents may be produced through interaction with a person, an external agency, with whom, if we have any interaction, that encounter with the undesirable person may produce a contrary, a negative modification, vritti in our mind, which may be undesirable, unhelpful. That's the idea behind. So, total there are 5 categories. Pratyaksha, Anumana, Agamaha, Pramanani. So before that he is in the 6th sutra, Pramana Vibhire Vigalpa Nidra Smrteka. First there are some vrittis which are valid. For example, you see something in front of you, which is totally valid. We see an object in front of you. That object, that visual experience could produce vrittis. Some of them may be helpful, klishta, some of them may be painful, klishta. So, the reason why Patanjali gives such a detailed analysis of the internal modifications that we may experience in our encounter with the external world is, if we know them, we will be able to be on our guard. If a negative thought currents come, then if we study Patanjali Sutra properly, we may be able to understand this is the negative thought current that Patanjali speaks about. Or if you get these negative thought currents through conversation with a person who may put a negative idea in your brain, then also you will be able to be on your guard. Well, this is not the right kind of idea that I must have. I must discard them. One of our great Swamis, senior Swamijis, used a term called filtering mechanism. If you study Patanjali Sutras properly, you will be able to evolve a kind of internal filtering mechanism, which filters away all undesirable thought currents, impressions, which may be harmful for our mind. In fact, in many cases of anxiety neurosis, problems are mostly due to our inability to avoid unnecessary thought currents and tendencies coming from an external source. You could be reading a book, it may be interacting with a person who may be the source of negative ideas and thought currents. So, the first type is pratyaksha. Pratyaksha means direct perception. When you see an object, or when you hear the sound of an object by which you come to know of the existence of an object that produces the sound, or when you come to know the existence of a flower by smelling that, because these are all different senses of perception. All these can create vrittis, modifications. So, one is pratyaksha. Anumana means here inference. When we try to understand something on the basis of a previous experience, through the analysis of cause and effect relationship, it is called inference. Or when we read a book, that also can be a source of vritti. So from all these, different modifications may emerge in the mind. Now, these are all different sources of valid, dependable knowledge. Now, there is a reason why Patanjali uses this particular pramana. Pramana means valid source of knowledge in epistemology. Valid source of knowledge. Direct perception, inference, comparison, presumption, or verbal testimony, or absence. All these are different sources of information, understanding in epistemology, theory of knowledge. They are all valid knowledge. But then there is another kind of knowledge, another kind of vritti which may come, which may emerge in the mind. Even when you hear or when you read about something which doesn't exist, then also it could create an impact on the mind, thought currents. So, that's called viparya. I have dealt with these subjects, so I will go rather fast to give a short, brief analysis of all this. I have discussed all these things much earlier. Verbal delusion. This also can be possible. So, again, sleep. Sleep also can be sleep, dreams and memory. All these can give birth to different modifications. Often when we study our mind, when we find that we are fighting against an invisible adversary whom we cannot see, but who is a very real opponent, adversary, like a dead wall, we cannot, there is always a conflict between what we would like to do and what we are able to do. A conflict between mind and intellect. Then we can appreciate the scientific rationale of this analysis. Patanjali says, dreams, sleep, memory, reading of books, interaction with people, different experiences involving mind and any or all of the five senses of perception can create a mental ripple, a vritti, a modification in the mind. It doesn't mean that we must be always watching what is happening in our mind. Later Patanjali will tell you. Instead of keeping a close watch on our mind, what we must do, we must focus the mind towards a higher ideal. Then mind will naturally withdraw from undesirable thought currents. For that, the commentators say that we must sublimate our focus, we must sublimate our desire. There is an interesting description of the rationality of restlessness in one of the commentaries. Psychologically, it's a great insight that we see in this commentation. See, we all become restless. Now, can we become restless for something higher, something noble? Can we sublimate, elevate our desire, refine and purify our desire from a lower to a higher level? That is the first step towards yoga. These ideas are again explained in the next chapter. So, we already dealt with two types of restlessness. Klishta state and then, kshipta state and vikshipta state. Vikshipta state corresponds to a state of total mental restlessness, total anarchy, chaos, where mind is full of dirt and filth, malice, anger, and so it completely gets lost. Next stage, what happens? The mudha state, mind gets infatuated towards some worldly desires, worldly objects, as it tries to run away from this chaotic state of restlessness. In the third state, you are trying to sublimate this restlessness. You are trying to become restless for something higher, not for money, wealth, or worldly pursuits, trying to be restless for a higher spiritual goal. In fact, that is the first stepping stone towards yoga. That's why the third stage is very important, Vikshipta stage, where you are already connected to some spiritual idea, but you are not able to stay there. Suddenly the pendulum moves back and moves in the opposite direction. Want to meditate, want to do something wonderful. Then after some time, maybe next day, oh, these are all worthless things, I will move in the opposite directions. Why? Because the mind is full of thought currents that we have accumulated in this life, so next life. There are wonderful ideas, wonderful samskaras, wonderful tendencies in the mind. If we associate with people who invoke those wonderful tendencies that we have accumulated in the mind, then we are able to do great things, good things. But if we associate with ideas that may indirectly invoke the re-emergence of undesirable thought currents that are accumulated in this mighty bag which is called mind, then undesirable thought currents also re-emerge. Then we decide, today I don't meditate, these are all worthless, useless, all these things. Something like that. So, that's a state of Vikshipta state. At this state, the commentators give one very interesting recommendation. Try to sublimate your desire. Try to sublimate, elevate, purify restlessness. So Sri Ramakrishna says, be restless for God, because you're always living in a state of mind of God. Be restless for something higher, noble, something pure, something spiritual. Otherwise, you will be restless for something much worse. Mind will not remain. Mind will be restless. So, let this restlessness be diverted towards something creative, constructive, spiritual. Otherwise, the mind will remain restless for something nasty and undesirable. So, now, in this 12th sutra, Patanjali gives a solution to this problem. How to purify, sublimate these tendencies. Abhyasa vairagyabhyam tad nirodhaka. How to stop this modification, this mind stuff, misidentifying itself with different modifications that emerge in the mind. When something unpleasant happens, we think we are nothing but just a helpless human being who is experiencing this undesirable thing. So we become miserable. In Vedantic tradition, we must try to counter this by trying to focus on the idea that we are Atman, we are not this physical or psychological or mental mechanism, we are an omnipresent or pervading reality. That's a Vedantic approach. Of course, I didn't go to these details. Today, before concluding, I will just, before going ahead with the 12th Sutra, a few words I must say by way of introduction. There are different types of yoga. What we are dealing with now is Patanjali's system of yoga in the light of Vedanta. Because Patanjali's system of yoga is related to Sankhya philosophy, where you meditate on an object. Vedantic system of yoga is related to the Upanishads, the Vedantic scriptures, which teach us that the whole creation is one, the whole humanity is one spiritual family. Man in his true nature is an omnipotent, omnipresent, immanent spiritual reality. This is the high universalistic, humanistic spiritual philosophy of Vedanta. Patanjali's system doesn't contain a strong ontological or metaphysical doctrine. It is essentially a psychological study of human mind, so that we can keep our mind in a state of complete tranquility and calmness. And as for the physical yoga that you hear so much about these days, it is called Hatha Yoga, which belongs to a different sampradaya called Nath Sampradaya. Gorakhnath and Matsyendranath, two great teachers who propagated this sampradaya, which is not really directly related to Vedanta or Patanjali system, but then Patanjali refers to that only in a very brief way, only one sutra. So then there is Tantric Yoga, where you hear about Kundalini Yoga and so on. I didn't deal with these topics earlier because we are going to deal with these topics in the next chapter, when we discuss the next chapter. So now we didn't have class for almost a month. So if you would like to recapitulate, we can discuss. We have about 10 minutes for discussion, 10-15 minutes for discussion. You can raise questions and we can discuss the matter in this class. Okay.
There's some talk of the identification with the body and the mind in the 5 states of the mind.
Oh, yeah, yes. Yes. In the first 2 stages, you don't have any perception of your sense of individuality other than the physical body. That's why the restlessness comes. In fact, so long as we are at the physical level, where the mind also is at the physical level, our goal is to go beyond the physical, to reach the mental, and then go beyond the mental to supramental. But in the first 2 stages, we are at the lowest physical level. That's why the slightest problem at the physical life experience makes you restless, or you get completely infatuated, stupefied by physical things.
There's also the identity with the mind, isn't there? I am the mind.
That's there, but there, mind is a slave of the body. That's why the slightest problem makes the mind restless. Total anarchy, psychological mental anarchy, is an important characteristic of the first stage, which is called a kshipta state, total restlessness. Now, if your mind is controlled by the body, mind will be totally in a very chaotic state. If your body is controlled by the mind, then it will be less chaotic. The slightest problem at the physical level completely upsets the mind, because mind dictates terms to body dictates terms to mind. If the mind is stronger, then many of the physical problems will not upset mind. Mind is stronger. But the first stage is the body that controls everything, that dictates terms to mind. Mind is an instrument in the hands of the body. That's the first, most primitive state of human evolution. That's where total chaos. Such people will not be able to get high grades in examinations, will not be able to do any useful work, and will not be able to focus on anything, will not even be able to keep their jobs. Suddenly they will fight with people all around.
So in the ekagra state, what is happening to the mind? Is it looking at itself?
At the second state.
Ekagra.
A ekagra state, where there, mind gets focused on one noble idea. Now the question arises, mind keeps projecting new ideas every moment. So how can mind remain focused on one idea? So the Patanjali doesn't say, but the commentators say, the same idea repeats. There is continuity of concentration. There is no fragmentation of the mind. You are continuously focused on one great sublime idea. That is fourth stage called Ekagra state. A state of, we don't use the word concentration because in English translations of Patanjali Yoga Sutra, the word concentration is often used to mean yoga. So it will be a great misunderstanding if you use the word concentration for yoga. It's called one-pointedness. If we can become one-pointed, then we can achieve great things in this world. Mind is not able to exert its full energy and potential because mind gets fragmented. When mind tries to do something, a contrary thought comes and emerges, and that takes away power of concentration. Fragmented mind is not capable of any concentration. Many geniuses, scientists, painters, musicians, those who have made great contribution in different areas, there are many great geniuses. They didn't care for any worldly pleasures. They were always, maybe not these days when you can store your scientific data in a computer and go to nightclub, no problem. But in ancient times, scientists had to keep their ideas in their mind and had to contemplate on that. A man like Newton, he could not store anything in the computer. So the man almost became insane in a higher sense. He could not think of anything other than his scientific ideas. But modern scientific age cannot produce a Newton because you can put everything in a computer and think of something else. So some of the great painters, musicians, geniuses must have reached a very high level of the fourth stage of concentration, called one-pointedness. So ekagrasti. Eka means one, agra means the point of a spear. That's called agra, point of a spear or a needle. So their mind was very sharp. It went straight to the subject and nowhere else, hitting the bullseye, so to speak. So that state could produce many outstanding discoveries in science, in mysticism, in poetry, in philosophy, in many other areas, where you forget everything else. You identify yourself with what you are doing. It may be music, it may be meditation, it could be like that. But it need not always be a very spiritual thing, but it is certainly a very high state of one-pointedness. Because after that, they may not be able to reach at that state. But still, the level of one-pointedness is very much essential to achieve anything in the intellectual level. Otherwise, it's not possible. Any other subject?
Whether the sutras as compressed text, compressed expression, are poetic, or is the language intended more to build a scientific system? Is it more prose or poetry?
Patanjali's sutras can be fully understood. All the implications could be understood only in the light of the commentaries. So most of the modern translations are based on an interpretation of the sutras as given in these commentaries. Because the 196 small pithy statements, that's what, just a few pages, that's what Patanjali Yoga Sutra is all about, in fact. So the description of mind into these 5 states, kshipta, mudha, vikshipta, ekagra and niruddha, are not given in the sutra literature. But there are elaborate commentaries written originally in Sanskrit. Some of them are translated in English. Many of them are translated in English. But the problem is literal translations won't be of much help because they almost try to translate Sanskrit words literally. And without a proper interpretation, it may not be able to fully understand these things, so it's called.
But isn't there a structure like there are groups of sutras? The first 5 sutras, for example.
The first 5 is the first sutra deals with no vyadha yoga anushasana. Now we start this yoga. Yoga citta vritti nirodha. This is a definition of yoga, and then tadadashtu surubhi avasthanam. Unless you reach the yoga state, you always identify the different vrittis. When you reach the yoga state, drashtu surubhi avasthanam, the scene get completely immersed in the seer. Now, these terms may not make much sense unless it is explained by somebody. Its greatest contribution and relevance in modern times is that it makes a clear distinction between the mental, the psychological ideas that emerge in our mind and their formation into tendencies and potentialities called samskara. See, look at this cycle. Whatever we do, whatever we experience mentally, verbally, physically, in whatever way, all this will create a modification in the mind. Is it obvious? That Jung and Adler all will accept. Okay. But then these tendencies together configure and form a strong potency, which is called samskara, which may re-emerge again, if not in this life, after 100 lives. So, if you are reading Patanjali Yoga Sutra today, if you are able to meditate and if you are able to enjoy spiritual life, it's maybe because we have been working hard not only in this life, maybe hundreds of years back. See, there is an interesting sutra in Patanjali system. Satu dirghakala nairandarya satkara asevido dridhabhumi. Psychologically, it is supposed to be very, very, very potent, very relevant sutra. It means this. If we want to practice yoga, meditation, spirituality, you must do it continuously without a break. Nairandarya means like oil that you pour oil into from one bottle to another bottle. There will be no break. If you pour water, there could be break. If you pour oil, it will remain. So Nairandarya means in unbroken succession without any break, in total continuity. And you should be able to do it for a long time. Now, if you want to do something continuously for a long time, there is an important psychological need. You should love doing that. You should love doing. The satkara means you should honor it, means you should respect it. Unless you love meditation, you can't sit for a long time. I've seen in Hatha Yoga classes, they sit straight, but only 1 second they fall down. I mean, the muscles, they flex their muscles and sit straight, and then head goes down this way, that way. Because mind should be focused on something which goes beyond the body. The mind should be taken away and above the body level. Otherwise, you will not be able to keep the body intact. Because the slightest problem at the bodily level will disturb the bodily posture. So mind should be able to go beyond the body. Because the problems of the mind are sought to be solved by Patanjali at the spiritual level, not the mental level. If you want to solve the problems of the mind at mental level, you are trying to solve the problems of a sick mind with a sick mind. So mind should be linked, attached, connected to a higher spiritual entity. Then mind remains calm. So the problems of the mind are solved at the supra-mental level by Patanjali. That's the idea behind. So, see, this is psychologically very, very, very obvious. If you want to do something for a long time, continuously, and if you hate it, you cannot do it. So you should respect it. Satkara means you should honor it. That's the idea. So many interesting, see, if you tell students, for example, well, I can't study, it means he's not interested in studying, or she. If a person say, I'm not interested in studies, it means he is interested in watching something else. No one can remain without any interest in anything unless he is a saint. If anybody remains without interest in anything, he should be a great saint, or he may be a liar. There is no other alternative. So, that's why Patanjali says we must sublimate, we must refine, we must purify, we must elevate our focus of concentration by elevating restlessness. Be restless, but be restless for something higher, something noble. That's a very, very rational approach. So we will have the class in the next Friday. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Sri Ram Krishna Arpanamastu.